Hi. Last lecture we finished talking about the hormone and homeostasis regulation. So that we already knew now that the hormones to be effective, it needs not to be too quickly destroyed or too slow in action in order to have its effect optimum. And too much of hormone is not a good thing for the body, as well as too slow degradation process. It's not good for the body. We'll continue our lecture today about the agonist and the antagonist. So these are two important terms are used to refer to molecules that bind to hormone binding sites of receptors. So what is agonist? Agonist is the molecule that binds the receptor and induce all the post-receptor events that lead to a biological process. It acts like normal hormone, but more or less potent. The natural hormones are agonists, and in many cases, more than one hormone can bind to the same receptor. For a given receptor, the different agonists can have dramatically different potentialities. So what about antagonists?
دكتور شو يعني آخر جملة؟
Sorry?
شو يعني آخر جملة؟
For a given receptor, different agonists, if you have different agonists or different hormone, that means they have a different effect, okay?
Okay.
For antagonists, molecules that bind the receptor and they block the binding of agonists. That's why it has the opposite action of an agonist. So these antagonists fail to trigger intracellular signaling events. So you have a receptor. Normally, the agonist binds to the receptor. If this receptor binds with the antagonist, the effect is diminished or absent. So the antagonists don't themselves perform the useful work, but block the activity of the other agonists. Okay. Hormone antagonists are used as drugs. So you can see here from the figure, normally the agonist bind to the receptor, and this in the first figure, normally the agonist bind to the receptor, and this induced a full activation. In case sometimes their competition on the same receptor from the agonist and antagonist, this competition lead to less activation. In case in the presence of antagonist alone, it will bind to the same receptor, and this will lead to no activation. So it's a kind of a mode of regulation of the response of the target cell. Here you can see the natural ligand binds to the receptor as a key in a lock. In case of agonist, it's something similar to the natural ligand, but can fit inside, the agonist, it's something similar to the natural ligand and can activate as well a response. In case of antagonist and in case of a competition, this antagonist, if it succeeds to bind to the receptor, it will not open the lock. That's why it will suppress the action of the hormone or the agonist. So how this regulation and the control of endocrine activity occur? The functions of the hormone can be broadly grouped into several categories, either reproduction and sexual differentiation, development and growth, maintenance of internal environment, and the regulation of metabolism and nutrient supply. So the physiologic effect of hormone depend on their concentration in blood and the extracellular fluid. So the higher the concentration or the optimum concentration of the hormone, it will do its function. Once the concentration fails, the function is diminished. So disease result when hormone concentration are either too high or too low, as we said before. Again, the disease result when the hormone concentration are either too high or too low. Taking an example, the insulin hormone. So the normal function of the insulin hormone is to control the blood sugar level. So if the concentration of insulin abnormally low in the blood, so the glucose will not be either stored or degraded. Okay, so it will the blood sugar level will be high, and if the insulin concentration is in the blood is too high, this will lead to more. This will lead to more breaking down of glucose or storage of the glucose. This will will lead to very low blood sugar level, and it's abnormality condition. So hormones needs a precise control over its concentration, because this is a crucial for the proper function of the hormone. So the concentrations of hormone is required to control. This concentration of hormone required to control most metabolic and endocrine function, as are incredibly small. The concentration are very small because, as we said, higher concentration have adverse effects. Their concentration normally of hormones in blood range from 1 picogram to 1 few microgram per millimeter of blood. Similarly, the rates of secretion of hormone are extremely small, microgram or milligram per day. The concentration of hormone as seen by the target cell is determined by 3 factors. So we will now talk about how the target cell see or sense the concentration of the hormone. It depends on the rate of production of the hormone. And this actually depends on the positive and the negative feedback circuits. We'll talk about these circuits later. And as well, the sensation of the target cell depends on the rate of delivery of the hormone. An example of this effect is the blood flow, because hormones are in blood. So the blood flow to the target organ means high blood flow will deliver more hormone than low blood flow. And as well, the rate of degradation and elimination. So hormone have a characteristic rate of decay, normally have a characteristic rate of decay. Once the hormone did its function, it needs to be degraded. And these hormones are metabolized and excreted from the body through different routes. So again, the concentration of the hormone seen by or sensed by the target cell is determined by 3 factors: the rate of production, the rate of delivery, and the rate of degradation and elimination. So how the blood can be cleared, how the hormone can be cleared from the blood. 2 factors can increase or decrease concentration of hormone in blood. The rate of hormone secretion into the blood is a factor, and the rate of removal of hormone from blood is a factor. And this rate of removal of hormone from blood is called the metabolic clearance rate. This metabolic clearance rate, actually, it is the rate of disappearance of the hormone from the plasma or from the plasma. That means it controls the concentration of the hormone. Hormones are cleared from the plasma in several ways. So we'll talk now about how hormone is cleared from the plasma of the blood. Either there is a metabolic destruction by tissues just destroy the hormone. Binding with tissue will decrease the concentration of hormone in the blood. The hormone can be excreted by the liver into bile. And as well, the hormone can be excreted by kidneys into urine. Okay, so these are the 4 mechanisms by which the hormone is cleared from the blood, or actually from the plasma of the blood. most of the peptide hormones and the catecholamines are water soluble and circulate freely in the blood. They don't need carriers. And they are usually degraded by enzymes in the blood and tissues and rapidly excreted by kidneys and liver, thus remaining in the blood for only a short time. So peptide hormones and catecholamines remain in the blood very short time owing to the clearance by kidney and liver, degradation and clearance by kidney and liver. Hormones that are bound to plasma protein, some other hormone need to circulate in the blood to get bound to plasma proteins. These kind of hormones are cleared from blood as a much slower rate and can remain in the circulation for several hours or days, which is different than the peptide hormones and catecholamines. As an example, the half-life of adrenal steroids in circulation range between 20 to 100 minutes, whereas the half-life of protein-bound thyroid hormones can be as long as 6 days. So you notice the difference here between a hormone that can be found in the blood freely and another hormone like the thyroid hormones that need a carrier in the blood to move in the blood. So the hormones that need a carrier protein in the blood or carrier plasma protein takes longer days, longer time to be degraded, as evident by the half-life. So what are the feedback control of hormone production? The hormones is subject to negative feedback control. That's what's meaning of negative feedback control or feedback loops. Actually, we have normally many mechanisms in our body in which if the hormone increases in its concentration above normal, or if the hormone finishes its function, it needs to be either degraded or excreted. So the negative feedback loop actually control the optimum concentration of the hormone and will shut down the more synthesis of the hormone in order not to have an over function of that hormone. So how these feedback loop occur? There are several ways for feedback loops to occur. And the disturbance in the feedback loops actually are clinically important. So if we fail to have a normal feedback loop to control the concentration of the hormone in our body, this will lead to clinically significant disorders. And these clinically important, this disturbance in the feedback loop and significant in diagnosis is vivid. The negative feedback is much more common than the positive feedback. So normally we have a lot of negative feedback loops than the positive feedbacks. Of course, the positive feedback, this leads to increase the concentrations of the hormone in the blood. Negative feedback is seen when the output of a pathway inhibits the input of the pathway. In other words, when the negative feedback work on shutting down the input of the pathway, That means the negative loops works on decreasing the concentration of the hormone in the blood, which is the input of the pathway. So you can see here from this figure, you have an hypothalamus, which is a gland. We'll talk in details later on. A hypothalamus is a gland occur in the brain. This releases hormone 1. This hormone 1 activates anterior pituitary gland, which is another master gland present in the brain as well. This hormone 1 will activate the anterior pituitary gland to release the stimulating hormone, which we call it now hormone 2, for example. So the release hormone stimulates anterior pituitary to secrete the stimulating hormone. This stimulating hormone migrates through the blood and the outside of the brain to reach the target gland, which actually secrete the hormone 3, which is the actual hormone for the target cell. So you can see this is a sketch showing the 3 levels of the hormone secretion. It needs an order from the hypothalamus. Then this hypothalamus release hormone, secrete the releasing hormone, which activate the stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary that activate the target gland to release the actual hormone, which is hormone 3. This is the normal pathway of hormone, as a general pathway for the hormone production. So there is a level of a feedback control or a negative feedback control where the hormone 3 itself will inhibit the release of the stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So in other words, when the hormone 3 levels is increased by a certain mechanism, it will order the anterior pituitary gland to stop releasing the stimulating hormone or hormone 2. Okay. There is another feedback as well that hormone 3 can act on the hypothalamus, and this shuts down this pathway starting from the beginning, from hypothalamus, to stop secrete the releasing hormone. So you can see here there is 2 mechanisms of feedback loop or negative feedback loop. Again, so you have the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, or themselves are controlled by negative feedback inhibition, and they are regulated actually by the hormone whose secretion they stimulate. So you can see from the figure again, you have the hypothalamus can secrete releasing hormones like the thyroid releasing hormone, like the gonadotropin releasing hormone, like the corticotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone. As an example, these releasing hormones stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release the tropic hormones. Okay, like the follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and the adrenal corticotropic hormone. As an example, these tropic hormones, each one of them act on specific target organs, like the thyroid, adrenal cortex, and gonads. Once the function of this hormone is terminated, the same hormone starts to do a negative feedback loop. You can see the hormone can do an inhibition on the anterior, on this level, on the anterior pituitary gland. The same hormones can do as well an inhibition on the hypothalamus gland. So that's explains how the negative feedback inhibition can be regulated by the same hormone whose secretion they stimulate. So they initially stimulate this hormone, and once the function is terminated and their concentration level is higher in the blood, these hormones themselves will start to negatively regulate either the anterior pituitary gland to stop its release or the hypothalamus to stop its release. Okay. Again, as a feedback mechanism, you can see how the cascade of activation of the hormone occurs. So initially, you have an environmental signal. This environmental signal, either external or internal. Okay, you can see this will affect or trigger the central nervous system, which will give an electrical or chemical transmission that activate the hypothalamus. Once the hypothalamus is activated, it has 2 different routes. through the because the hypothalamus actually it's a gland in the brain that is as well is innervated. Through the axonal transport, it will release two important hormones, which is oxytocin and the vasopressin. These two hormones, through the neurohypophysis. What is the neurohypophysis? We'll talk later in details about that. So initially, from now, we need to know that the pituitary gland consists of two regions, the pituitary gland, majorly of two regions, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. Normally, the anterior pituitary gland is called adenohypophysis, while the posterior pituitary gland is called neurohypophysis. So the posterior pituitary gland or the neurohypophysis will release two important hormones coming from the hypothalamus, as we said, the oxytocin and vasopressin. The main function of the oxytocin is two functions. It will induce uterine contraction during delivery of babies, and as well it induces lactation for breastfeeding for babies. While the water, for the vasopressin, it induces water retention or water balance. So it keeps on the concentration of water inside our body. The second route of the hypothalamus is to release nanograms of the releasing hormone that will activate the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary gland, to release hormones in micrograms. So the anterior pituitary only needs nanograms to release hormones in micrograms. These stimulating hormones will go to the target organs or target glands like the thyroid gland, gonads, and to give the ultimate hormone in micrograms or milligrams to do the hormonal response. Okay, so this is the normal pathways that occur through the hypothalamus and through the either through the anterior pituitary gland or the posterior pituitary gland, either through the adenohypophysis, which is the anterior pituitary gland, or through the neurohypophysis, which is the posterior pituitary gland. For a negative control, you can see that at the level of the anterior pituitary hormone that is released from the anterior pituitary gland, it can have a short feedback loop that will shut down the hypothalamus. There is another level, another level of negative regulation is done by the ultimate hormone itself through shutting down the hypothalamus or even the central nervous system. And this is a longer feedback loop. So we have a short feedback loop and a longer feedback loop. There is a much faster feedback loop. This faster feedback loop, it will shut down the adenohypophysis and the hypothalamus at the same time to ensure that the hormone secretion is terminated. Again, you can see there are three levels now. The central nervous system input will affect the hypothalamus, that in turn will affect the pituitary gland, that will turn affect the target gland. There are three tiers of control through this process. You have the tier 1, the hypothalamic hormones that is released by the hypothalamus. It will affect tier 2 in the pituitary region through the secretion of a paracrine, cytokine, and growth factor. And you have the tier 3, which is the peripheral hormone that will do each function. You can see the arrows how from the feedback loop occur. So the hormone released from the target gland can affect the pituitary gland. And as well, the pituitary gland can affect itself for shutting down, either stimulating or inhibiting the release of the hormones. Okay? So as we said, there are three levels of control through the hypothalamus and the pituitary axis of hormone production, okay? this is the model for regulation of anterior pituitary hormone secretion by these three tires. So any abnormality in these, actually it's not only these axes that operate in our body, there is a lot of axes of hormonal secretions. And the last one was one of the examples. But generally the endocrine diseases fall into 5 broad categories. If there is a hormone overproduction, that's mean a hyperfunction of the gland, the target gland, this will lead to a disease. As well as if there is a hormone under reproduction, that's mean will lead to a hypofunction of the gland, and this will lead to a disease as well. If there is an altered tissue response to the hormone, that's mean sometimes the receptor is defective, it will not sense the hormone, and this will lead to a disease as well. If there is a tumor in the endocrine gland, this will lead to a disease because it will secrete a lot of hormones. And as well, if the problem in the hormone itself and there is hormone deficiency, this will lead to a disease. So actually it's a 6 categories, not 5. So the 6th one is the second messenger defect. So if you have a problem in the second messenger defect, as we said, the second messengers, we talked about examples of the second messengers in last lecture, there will be a disease, endocrine disease as well. So these are the 6 categories which endocrine disease fall into. So
Doctor, can you repeat number 4, please?
Number 4. Tumors of the endocrine gland. If the endocrine gland have tumors like tumors in the thyroid gland, the tumor in the pancreas, it will lead to the overproduction of the hormone. Okay.
Okay.
So this figure only shows the position of the hypothalamus. So you can see that the hypothalamus located deeply inside the brain. Okay, here is the hypothalamus deeply inside the brain, and it is above the pituitary gland. As we said before, the hypothalamus is controlling the pituitary gland. So this is the pituitary gland. So actually the pituitary gland is above the roof of our buccal cavity, or buccal cavity, our mouth. When you open your mouth, the pituitary gland is above this, and deep inside the brain you can see the hypothalamus. So where is the hypothalamus? Hypothalamus is located in the middle of the base of the brain, and is encapsulated by the ventral portion of the 3rd ventricle of the brain. So you can see the hypothalamus is here, and this is the region of the brain which is called a 3rd ventricle. Okay, and this hypothalamus is encapsulated by the ventral portion of the 3rd ventricle. While the pituitary gland, which we call it, another name for the pituitary gland is called hypophysis, lies just beneath the hypothalamus, resting in a region called sella torica at the base of the brain. And generally it's 1 centimeter in diameter, this pituitary gland, and weighs around up till 1 gram in weight. So this figure shows the location of 2 very important glands, which is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You can see that as well, that above the the pituitary gland and below the hypothalamus, you can see an optic chiasma. So what is optic chiasma? حد عارف what is the optic chiasma?
Something related to the
vision area.
It's not the vision area. Actually, if you know that our eye is controlled by the other part of the brain. So that's mean the right eye is controlled, it's got innervated from the left portion of the brain, while our left eye is controlled by innervation from the right portion of the ear. At the region of the intersection between the fibers, the optic fibers of the 2 eyes, This point of intersection is called optic chiasma. Okay? So the pituitary gland lies just beneath the intersection of the two optic nerves that go to each eye. The intersection, this region is called optic chiasma. Okay? So this figure shows the location of each of hypothalamus and pituitary gland, which is called as well hypophysis. So you can see that the hypothalamus integrate functions that maintain homeostasis, either chemical or temperature homeostasis. It controls the release of hormone from the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. It synthesis releasing hormone. So the hormone which is released from the hypothalamus is called a releasing hormone. It synthesis this hormone in the neurons that have, in cell bodies of the neurons that have. These hormones are transported down the axon of this neuron and is stored in the nerve endings of that neurons. And then these hormones are released in pulses. So you have now the hypothalamic releasing hormone. Releasing hormone, again, the hormones that is released from the hypothalamus is called releasing hormone. So we have 7 releasing hormone are made in the hypothalamus. The thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, the corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, the growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, the growth hormone releasing inhibiting hormone, GHIH, the prolactin releasing hormone, PRF, the prolactin inhibiting hormone, PIH. This secretion of these releasing hormones can be affected by emotions, can be affected by the metabolic state of the individual. Okay? These releasing hormones are delivered to the anterior pituitary gland via what is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So you can see the name have the 2 portions of the axis. The hypothalamic comes from the hypothalamus, and the hypophyseal comes from the hypophysis, which is the other name of the pituitary gland. So again, these releasing hormones are moved to the or transferred to the anterior pituitary gland through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. So talking more on the hypothalamus pituitary gland, this thalamus receives sensory information, relays some to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus monitors the body temperature, pH, and other conditions. These signals, as we said, the pituitary gland if condition need to be corrected. So if the condition need to be corrected, the hypothalamus will signal the pituitary gland to do the correction. The pituitary is the master gland of our body that signal other gonads or other glands to produce their hormone when needed. The anterior lobe of the pituitary receives signal from the hypothalamus and respond by sending out the enough amount of hormone to the endocrine glands. While the posterior pituitary receive only 2 kinds of hormone, the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which is the vasopressin. So oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone is the same hormone. They come from the hypothalamus, relays them to the body as necessary. When our body needs this hormone, they come out from the hypothalamus through the posterior pituitary gland. So you can see here again, you can see the hypothalamus on top sits over the optic chiasma, just above the pituitary gland, which is composed of anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary, connected to the brain through a stalk called hypophyseal stalk. Looking closely inside the anatomy, you can see that the hypothalamus mainly consists of neurons, where they synthesize the hormone inside the cell body of the neurons. In case if the hypothalamus will send information to the anterior pituitary, the senses hormone is released through the terminals and then move from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, as we said, through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. While in case if the hypothalamus will release hormone to the posterior pituitary, it only releases to the posterior pituitary two hormones, the oxytocin and the ADH, which is the vasopressin. So this hypothalamus will sense the hormone inside their cell body, and this hormone is moved through the axons until reaching the posterior pituitary gland, where they are released from the posterior pituitary gland. So actually, the posterior pituitary gland doesn't do a lot in the production of the hormone. Again, you can see here is what we have said before. This system is a hypophyseal portal system. You can see that the hypothalamus, when giving order to the anterior pituitary gland, the axon of the neurons just terminate before reaching the pituitary. And the electrical signal is soon transformed to chemical signal that is conveyed to the anterior pituitary gland via the bloodstream. Okay, while in case in the posterior pituitary gland, you can see that the axon is extended up till reaching the posterior pituitary region, where the chemical signal is moved into the bloodstream and soon after get out from the posterior pituitary gland. And this confirms that the posterior pituitary gland doesn't do a lot in the hormone it secretes. If we look closely again here, this is the same figure showing that the neurons terminate before the anterior pituitary glands, while the neuron, in the case for the pituitary gland, terminates inside the posterior pituitary gland. So you can see initially, the neurosecreting cells of the hypothalamus produce the releasing hormone. It's not only the releasing hormone, it can produce as well the inhibiting hormone. This releasing or inhibiting hormone, which is the green circle, you can see the green circles, are secreted into capillaries feeding the anterior pituitary gland. So it feeds the anterior pituitary gland. Once it is inside the anterior pituitary gland, it will stimulate the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary gland to form the red squares, which is actually the hormone. The hormone now can be released from the anterior pituitary gland to the bloodstream. Okay, so this is the mechanism which is occurring through the anterior pituitary gland. While in the case of the posterior pituitary gland, you can see that the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus, it will secrete only two hormones, oxytocin and the ADH. This oxytocin and the ADH, which is the blue triangles, will be stimulated and released into blue triangles, as you can see, are secreted into the blood inside the posterior pituitary gland, which will be conveyed to the blood flow via the capillaries of the posterior pituitary gland. So as we said before, the posterior pituitary gland doesn't do a lot through the process of the formation of the hormone. It is only stimulated. It's only stimulated to release this hormone, the oxytocin and ADH, into the blood. We will talk in details for each axis of this, but generally we can have a general look about what anterior pituitary gland responsible for and what posterior pituitary gland responsible for. So we already knew that the posterior pituitary gland is only responsible for two major hormones, the oxytocin and the antidiuretic hormone. The oxytocin, as we said, will affect majorly two locations: the uterine muscle contraction during delivery and the lactation for breastfeeding, while the ADH will affect the kidney function for controlling the amount of water present in our blood. For the anterior pituitary gland, the number of hormone is much greater. So it releases the thyroid stimulate hormone, which will affect the thyroid gland, as well as adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will affect the adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. The growth hormone, which will generally the growth hormone affect a lot of things, but majorly bone and muscles. It as well will secrete the gonadotropic releasing gonadotropic hormones like the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormone, which will affect the gonads, either testis or ovary. And as well, it will release the anterior pituitary gland, the prolactin, which will affect the mammary gland in mammals, as well as an important hormone which is called the melanocyte stimulating hormone, which will affect the melanocytes, especially in amphibians. So this is like a general figure showing the major function of each part of the pituitary gland. Again, if we look closely, so you can see that the anterior pituitary gland can release a thyrotropin, which will affect the thyroid gland. It can release as well prolactin, which will affect the mammary gland. Growth hormone, it will have many targets, so you can see it will affect the whole body. It will aid in metabolism of the glucose, as well as the corticotropin hormone affect the adrenal cortex hormone as well shares its part in the glucose level, as well as the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone will affect the ovary. All of these, the controlling of the blood sugar level, promote the secretion of insulin hormone from the pancreas to do the main function of lowering blood sugar level. So, so you can see here, for the pancreas to function and release insulin, it needs some of the signals from the anterior pituitary gland. In this slide is one of the important slides. It will show the diversity of cells in the anterior pituitary gland, and you can see the specialization of the cells to secrete specific hormones. So the anterior pituitary gland contains several different cell types. Each of them synthesize and secrete different hormone. So you can see that we have the somatotrophs, which secrete the human growth hormone. We have the corticotrophs, it secrete the adrenocorticotropin hormone. We have the thyrotrophs, which is secretes the thyroid stimulating hormone. We have the gonadotrophs, which secrete the gonadotropic hormone that include the LH and FSH. And you have the lactotrophs that secrete prolactin. So you can see from the figure, you have alpha cells, which is different than gamma cells, which is different from delta cells, which is different from epsilon cells. So we'll talk in details in the next lecture about each type of cells and what it is responsible for secreting. This table shows a summary about each of the hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland and its structure and its main function. So for the TRH, it is actually a peptide of 3 amino acid that stimulates the secretion of TSH by thyrotrophs. So thyrotrophs, it is the cells which exist in the anterior pituitary region. You have the gonadotropin releasing hormone. Actually, it consists of a single chain of a 10 amino acid that stimulates the secretion of FSH and LH by gonadotrophs. These ones are another type of cells exist in the anterior pituitary. You have the corticotropin releasing hormone, the CRH, which actually is a single chain of 41 amino acids, differ from the GHRH, which is a single chain of 44 amino acids. The first one, the CRH, stimulates the secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the corticotrophs, while the GHRH stimulates the secretion of growth hormone by the somatotrophs. You have the GIH, growth hormone inhibitory hormone, another name is called somatostatin, a single chain of 14 amino acids, and this of course inhibits the secretion of growth hormone by the somatotrophs. The PIH, actually another name is a dopamine, It is a catecholamine. It inhibits the synthesis of the synthesis and the secretion of prolactin by lactotropes. So again, this table summarize the structure of each hormone secreted from the anterior pituitary gland and the primary action on the anterior pituitary gland. The primary action on the anterior pituitary gland. And this concludes our third lecture, and I'm waiting for your questions.